Welcome to the Content Amplified podcast, brought to you by Masset. Our goal is to help you get more from your marketing content. Each episode is a 10 to 15 minute interview with industry experts that share amazing insights to help you squeeze as much juice from your content as you possibly can. Here's today's interview.
Welcome back to another episode of Content Amplified. Today I'm joined by Grant. Grant, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. Well, Grant, before we dive into the subject, let's get to know you a little bit. One of my favorite questions, what do you love about content and marketing? And then on top of that, let's get to know your career and a little bit about you.
Absolutely. I think content oftentimes is really the crux of the success of a business. You have to tell a great story. You have to engage people. You have to have a full funnel where you're leading people from point A to point B, to C to D to E to F to G. So at the end of the day, content becomes so important. And I think when we realize how it influences the entire success of a business, it's very exciting. With regard to me, I am currently the Chief Growth Officer at Adam.com. We are a Series A funded startup. We're in the naming and domain space. We help businesses who are typically launching, but sometimes rebranding, opening up new products, find that perfect name with the accompanying domain to launch successfully and have that really core branding asset. We used to be called squadhelp.com, but we recently rebranded to adam.com. With regard to my story, I started in local business. So my first job was actually as a martial arts instructor many, many years ago. And then I went on with a friend to start a local marketing agency and have been, moving to larger and larger businesses ever since. But I really love I love people who are building something, love working with companies that are either starting or growing. That's where my sweet spot and passion is.
I love it. That's the stage of company I enjoy as well. So it's definitely kindred spirits on that front for sure. So Grant, excited for this. Today we're going to talk about something that you have a ton of experience with, and really how to choose a name and a domain for your business or product. And I loved how you mentioned this can either be for brand new businesses, or I've been in the circumstance where like a rebrand was heavily needed, and using those resources would be so vital. But really, you have like this great process and framework for figuring this out. I'd love to hear more. What's kind of the process for figuring out how to pick a name and a domain, and when to do it and when maybe to shift to a new name domain?
Absolutely. Obviously the biggest time to pick a great name is right at the beginning. So if you're starting something, and too often people don't think about, I really should have something that I can build my brand upon. So I think that's important to remember. When it comes to rebranding, that's probably a whole class in and of itself. But some of the things that we often talk about are, if you're going to rebrand, you need to be moving away from something and towards something else. And while that sounds kind of vague, it's actually really, really important. You say, what about this brand isn't working? Is it the customer perception, or are you growing into something bigger and better and the brand doesn't fit anymore? So you have to define that. And then with that, where do you want to be when you grow up? I recently was commenting on the rebrand of the Boy Scouts of America. We were talking about, is it just for show, or do they really know where they want to be when they grow up? I have a feeling that they may not have a very clear vision, and it might be more tactical. And I think tactical rebrands are very, very risky. But to avoid too much of a digression, it's hard to rebrand. So don't do it unless you really need to. I think that's the end of it. When it comes to naming, there are 6 clear steps. You want to start by envisioning your brand. And this is so important that a lot of people forget this. I've talked to many, many companies, especially startups, and they say, I need a name for a fashion brand. It's not enough, right? You really need to step back and ask yourself the core questions. How do you want people to make you feel? How are you going to position yourself in the marketplace? How are you going to be a little bit different? A lot of times we talk about style within brand. So are you going to be more classic? Are you going to be really innovative? Are you going to be that outlier brand? So take time to understand how you're going to approach the market. And it doesn't have to be sophisticated. You don't have to hire an agency to do it, but just, really search your soul and try and understand where you're going to be, who you want to be, how you want to make people feel, those things. Number 2 is you want to write this down. I find that that's a big mistake that people make. They've thought about it. When you put it down on paper, there's something different that happens. I'm sure you've found that in your roles.
Yeah, absolutely.
So take the time to answer a few core questions about the business, the ones that I've been talking about, and put it on paper so that when you're looking back, you actually have something to point to. Okay, so now you have some framework and something to sink your teeth into. And really probably the hardest part of naming is coming up with ideas. So there's a couple options here, and you can grab your friends and you can start brainstorming. There's tools online that like the free tools like name generators that vary in quality. There's of course agencies that are typically very good, especially if you do your homework and find the right ones. We have some opportunities over at adam.com. We have crowdsourcing contests where you can work with a bunch of people and get hundreds, if not thousands, of names in a few days. We also have a curated marketplace of domains. So these have been both curated by domain experts and then recurated by our branding experts. So there's a lot of options as to how to find a domain, a name in a domain. But you got to have a big list, because as you pivot into the next step, which is whittling down your list to a short list. So step 4 is building a short list. And that's a really easy step. You brainstorm. One of the reasons I separate these two, when you brainstorming, you don't want to, as I'm sure you don't want to be picky. You don't want to say this one's good, this one. You just let the ideas flow. You use all the tools, you get a list, and then you say, okay, now I have 400 mostly bad ones. These 20 are pretty good. And then you move into validation. And validation is hugely important. This is where the domain comes in. In today's world, a name and a domain are somewhat inseparable. While there's, a little bit of leeway that we can talk about a little bit, almost everybody should be online, if not everybody. So if you can't find a good URL, so the validation I also call throwing it out. If you can't find a good URL, you got to throw it out. Number 2, if you can't get the trademark or somebody else is using that name, you got to throw it out. That's a clear one. People will come to me and they'll say, well, somebody else is using this in my industry. How do I still use that? You don't.
Mm-hmm.
Period.
Very true.
There's no workaround here. You just don't. The other one we look at a lot is audience. Is this something that resonates with your audience? So we're big into audience testing, where you take a list of your favorite names and you actually get some feedback from real people. We've had names that a company was, gung-ho about, and they've gotten 2 out of 100 votes. So it doesn't have to be like a rich 18-point, deep dive into the audience with a professional analyst on file and service, but you should get some feedback before you move forward. So that's 5, and there's 3 steps in 5, and then we move on to 6, which is choosing. And I said that brainstorming is probably the hardest, but really choosing the name is, I think, actually, I might have jumped the gun on that. Especially if you have 2 to 10 people. Choosing the name becomes incredibly difficult at that point, because nobody agrees, and there's no science behind it, and everybody thinks they're a naming expert to some extent. it becomes a little bit difficult. And there's some strategies that we have. One of them is to get buy-in behind a name. Once you can get two people to buy into a name, a third person will come, oh, okay, if you guys like that, I can start seeing the vision. The second strategy for choosing a name is what I call brand imagination. So try and envision the name coming to life. A word on a piece of paper, one of the hardest things about choosing a name, if you don't have that imagination, it's a word on a piece of paper. It's the best names in the world. If you wrote them on a napkin, you wouldn't be excited about it. You wouldn't be excited about Nike if you wrote it on a napkin. Phenomenal name. But you have to be able to say, okay, here's the people I'm going to get involved. Here's how we're going to position this. So there's it's really critical to, and it's really a skill, and it's pretty tough. So brand imagination, and then throwing out those immediate impulses. A name, especially without the rest of the brand, can spur strange things in your mind. I had one person, they had a name, and I forgot what the name was. They started telling me this story about how it reminded them about the way their grandma used to say the word spaghetti because she was, and I was like, come on, that's ridiculous. Like, I get it. You had that association. Let's just throw that out and decide if it's a good name. So those are the things that, get in people's way. Yeah. So that's the process right there.
That's powerful. I love the exact framework and the specific ways you should think about it and what you can do. A question that I have, and I've seen this in the past, when it comes to SEO and really trying to understand your branded search, things like that, some businesses have this strategy of picking a name that no one is searching, as opposed to picking something that may, yield a bunch of different results. Any insights or thoughts or advice when it comes to like the abstract kind of new word versus something that's maybe a little more typical, but you're not going to be able to sift the results in SEO as well?
If you have a good opportunity to own an amazing keyword related to your brand, that is something that you could consider. You can own SEO.com. You can own longtail.com. Absolutely. That's a cool opportunity if you want to actually build that business out. Because there's a lot of the brand alignment concept behind that. Usually what I find is most businesses, one, don't have that clear of a vision of who they want to be. I mean, for example, our business, we did several pivots. Like if we were namingcontest.com from the start, we would have drastically limited our ability to grow. It can be a good idea if you know what you're trying to do and you want to do that. Like hotels.com. They wanted to own the hotels and hotel industry. Phenomenal choice. Absolutely brilliant. Most of us couldn't even, begin to afford hotels.com.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. That's something that I've seen in the past, both for good and bad, where some terms do generate some keyword traffic, which is great. And on the other hand, it's almost impossible to measure your branded search because it's such a widely broad, specific word and things of that nature. So when you're going through this process, let's say just for 2 seconds that you had a larger business, 250 to 1,000 people, something like that. And like you said, businesses pivot all the time. And a business is ready to make a pivot. They've validated it. They feel it. They know it. And they need to adjust their name. Any recommendations for a business of like where they can start to wrap their head around that? Because I know a lot of businesses that probably need to think about that, but they're so intimidated about figuring out how do we manage this big of a change. Any last minute advice about that and how to approach that?
You have to have buy-in from everybody. You have to have the team on board. You have to have all the right people. It's very, very difficult. It's almost like relaunching the business. There are many, many aspects that you don't want to deal with. What you need to do is just map the whole thing out. So we just recently went through our rebrand and we got every single team, we outlined every single piece from every single team. What's SEO need to do? What's digital marketing need to do? Paid digital marketing need to do? What does the technology on the website? And it was a large roadmap for a long period of time. And the hardest thing about it, what we found, was we couldn't get anything else done, because the core, you couldn't hire people to do your core people had to be doing one thing that they weren't used to, and two things that were taking them away from the core stuff. So it's not easy, but in our situation, I think in a lot of situations, you have to make that call that the bigger vision is going to be worth it. And you just need to line up the people, line up the projects like anything else, be a project manager, and get work through it one day at a time.
I love it. That's great advice. Well, Grant, as promised, these episodes go by quickly. But before we end, if anyone wants to continue the conversation and reach out and connect with you online, how and where can they find you?
Well, they can come to adam.com for sure. I am also on Twitter at Grant Polachek, Polachek.
Love it. Awesome. Well, again, Grant, thanks for the time and advice today.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Content Amplified podcast. Please subscribe and leave us a review. And for additional ways to get more out of your content, visit our website at getmasset.com. That's getmasset.com. And tune in next time to the Content Amplified podcast.